Chapter 3, Key Issue 3, is about why people would migrate in the first place. So we'll be looking at push factors and pull factors, and we'll look at the flows of migrant workers in Europe and Asia. We'll be looking at three different types of push and pull factors: political, environmental, and economic push and pull factors. So people decide to migrate because of a combination of two factors. Push factors are things that are inducing people to move out of their present location. And pull factors are, factors that entice people to move into a new area. So push factors, it makes sense, right? They're pushing people out. Like, why would you want to leave your area? And pull factors, why are you choosing to move into this new area? There are three major types of push and pull factors: political, environmental, and economic. Political factors can be very compelling, sometimes even forcing people to migrate from a country. So political factors can induce voluntary migration, but oftentimes forced migration. The United Nations High Commissions for Refugees recognize three groups of forced political migrants, and the first is a refugee. A refugee is a person who's been forced to migrate to avoid a potential threat to his or her life, and they cannot return because they will be persecuted. This is a very specific definition, and it's important that you know it. So when we talked about forced migration in the beginning of the chapter, we talked about there's many different types of forced migration, and one type is being a refugee. So if you feel like you're being forced to migrate because you can't find a job, that doesn't mean that you're a refugee. People who were torn away from their families and forced into the slave trade, like, they weren't refugees. Refugees are fleeing a country. They are leaving, they are in fear of their lives, and they cannot return. If you're a political refugee, you're being persecuted by whatever government is in power. So right now we have a refugee crisis. We have many Syrian refugees pouring into surrounding Middle Eastern nations and into European nations. These Syrian refugees, many of them cannot return to Syria for fear of their life. The United States, we accept refugees from Cuba for political persecution. If you fled Cuba because of political persecution, particularly under Castro's regime, particularly in the 60s and 70s, you did not return for fear of your life. An internally displaced person is similar to a refugee, but they haven't crossed an international border. So in South Sudan, you have many internally displaced people right now. So there's a civil war going on in South Sudan, and if you are living in a camp set up in South Sudan, you haven't left the country yet, you're an internally displaced person. An asylum seeker is someone who has migrated to another country in the hopes of being recognized as a refugee. You won't get waves of asylum seekers. So an asylum seeker is usually an individual. They maybe have come to the United States and they would ask to stay because they're afraid to return home because of political persecution. But it's usually an individual or a small group of individuals. So you wouldn't have like an international asylum seeker crisis like you would have refugees. If you look at the refugee trends in 2012, we can see where the greatest sources of refugees are. Now, since 2012 and 2015, places like Syria really kind of took off. So Syria is not on this map. It's a little bit older. But today we would know that Syria as well has a large number of refugees. So we have a lot of refugees from Russia, many countries in the Middle East, and some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and Colombia. Colombia was in the midst of the civil war that ended last year. Where do people go? The United States and Canada were a common location for refugees, particularly Somalia. Somalia, we had over 150,000 Somali refugees moved to the United States. Many countries in Europe take refugees, and today this more countries would be colored in green because of the Syrian refugee crisis, which we'll talk about more in class, since it's not in your book yet. And then the yellow countries are people have also moved there. If you look at the countries in red, they have internally displaced persons. more than 100,000. So if you look at somewhere like Kenya, Kenya has more than 100,000 internally displaced people. So because of things like drought in Kenya, because of things like drought and famine in Yemen, because of war and terrorist threats in Somalia, because of war in Sudan, you have people who have lost their homes and are forced to move from their homes. And the environment can also prompt migration from hazardous environments, and it can pull migrants to either more attractive or just safer regions. So some environmental pull factors. People like to live near mountains, near the ocean, and in warm climates. So if you live near mountains, people move there. If you live on a coast, people tend to move there. And if you live in a warmer area, that's where people go. What pushes people away? Drought and flood are the most common. Today, the most common environmental threat would be water, flooding. And so we have a lot of what we call climate refugees, people who are starting to lose their homes because of rising sea levels. And so we have some examples of climate refugees in Louisiana. We have some in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I think it'll become, I believe, more and more common. And also drought. Either your crops are dying, it might spread to a famine. So drought spread out over many years when you don't have access to food, lead to a famine, and that pushes you out of your environment. Other environmental push factors that could make some kind of refugee would be like the earthquake in Haiti led to an environmental push factor. That's this earthquake made Haiti unsafe. The United States gave many Haitians refugee status because of that earthquake, and that status is up for renewal this year. So you'll hear probably a lot of talk in the news about what's going to happen in South Florida, what's going to happen with the people who moved here after the earthquake from Haiti. And then the economic reasons are the biggest reasons people migrate. So push factors, people migrate away from places that don't have jobs that they can hold. So if you can't make a living, that's going to be a push factor. People are going to be pulled into areas where there seem to be jobs available. The United States and Canada have historically been prominent destinations for economic migrants. So historically, people moved from Europe, and more recently, Latin America and Asia are the primary locations where people are immigrating into the United States from. And I think that's about it. We're going to go over the refugee crisis in class a bit more, and we'll go over migrant workers a bit more in class as well.